Well, hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Randy Silva. The channel is The Withered Fig Tree. I've been doing live streams about the importance of the Holy Spirit in the lives of Christians. The current series is called Spiritual Realities, and this is part 6. So let's go ahead and get started. So the title of today's episode is From Strange Phenomena to Scriptural Reality. So we're going to pivot a little bit today. Over the past 5 episodes, we have explored a wide range of unusual phenomenon, from things like near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, apparitions, mass Marian sightings, demonic possession and encounters, and various models of consciousness and the way the brain interfaces or creates, or how consciousness emerges from the brain. Rather than trying to prove any one of those phenomenon, or even really trying to interpret them as what exactly they imply, our goal has been to ask a simple question. What, if anything, can these experiences teach us about reality? Today, I will start by briefly reviewing what we've learned thus far, and also there's a couple things, important things that I noticed that I had failed to mention, so I'll bring those up just briefly, and then we will make this important transition that from this point forward, in the final 2 episodes, they will be totally about the New Testament and what we can glean from the New Testament about spiritual reality. We'll examine what it reveals about consciousness, salvation, things like moral accountability, and whatever this unseen world is that we call the afterlife, seeking to reveal any clue that Scripture provides. So the first slide is, what can these experiences tell us about reality? Now, I went ahead and, as I was thinking about the various phenomena that we've talked about thus far, initially I had 2 categories. Initially, I thought, does this talk about heaven and hell, or does it just talk about something that goes beyond our current reality? But then I realized there's also the physical reality that scientists and people who aren't spiritually minded, that they believe that's all there is to it. So I call that the neurophysical reality. So the neurophysical reality is how consciousness relates to the brain itself, along with the consciousness models that we discussed. I should have also mentioned these 2 things, amnesia and dissociative fugues. We'll talk about that here in a second, but those are very well documented phenomenon, and they demonstrate, even more so than just brain damage or memory loss, how profoundly damage to the brain can affect memory, personality, and identity. They present a significant challenge to simple spiritual models of consciousness. And I would say, in my opinion, that the best fit is the 4th model, which is the brain then spirit model that we discussed a couple episodes ago. So remember that the models were a materialist view, an integrated view, an avatar view. That's what I covered initially, and then in the next episode I came up with a 4th one, brain. I called it brain then spirit. Now, the materialist view can explain things like amnesia and dissociative fugues. So amnesia, you're probably familiar with. There's all different types of amnesia, where you have just a few minutes of lost memory to weeks or months of lost memories. In some cases, you lose the ability to form long-term memory thereafter. You can think of the movie 50 First Dates, where she was reliving the day over and over again, unable to make any new long-term memories beyond the day. And even in that movie, there was someone who had, I think it was 10 seconds. That would be really hard to experience or try to relate to. Imagine if every 10 seconds your whole reality was resetting and you didn't really even know it. Dissociative fugues are even more odd, oftentimes because of some sort of brain injury or stroke. Sometimes it's an unknown reason, but a person's personality totally resets and they become somebody else. And a lot of times they will leave their family, they will be thought to be dead or just a missing person. And then oftentimes it could be, a decade before this person reemerges into society and is able to recall his previous life, as well as their fugue life. And it's just a really odd phenomenon. It's very rare, but also very well documented. So if you think about these two types of problems that a rare number of people undergo, the materialist view says, well, just something happened to their brain. There's no spirit in this case. And so something happened in their brain, and this injury or whatever just disrupted their memories or disrupted their hypothalamus, so they can't transition from short-term to long-term memories, something like that. And with dissociative fugues, I'm not exactly sure what the neuroscience explanation for it, but you could imagine that they could explain something deep in the brain that gets reset and suddenly forms some sort of new consciousness. The integrated model and the avatar models will struggle with this, because if there is a spirit behind this person interfacing with their brain, either entirely in the case of the avatar model and then partially in the case of the integrated model, where was the spirit during this fugue or during the amnesia? Once the person dies, will they have any sort of memory of that, at least during their lifetime, was lost during amnesia? Or will they have memory of this other personality that they were living while they were under this fugue? The fourth model, though, the brain then spirit model, what that says is that the spirit is in the background of your consciousness. I guess you'd say it travels along with your body. And it is constantly also recording the experiences and being affected by and maturing with the experiences that you have while you're on Earth. And then it's only when you die that the spirit then leaves. There is no communication of the spirit to your consciousness while you're alive. It's only after you die that you then realize that you're, floating above your body and you're being sucked up into heaven or something like that. And that is, in these cases with amnesia and dissociative fugues, you would expect that spirit would then have memories of those things. They would have affected their experience on Earth, as it would affect their afterlife, the fact that they had this amnesia or these fugues. That's why that model, it's a new model to me, and I'm sure I didn't just create it or anything. I'm the first person to think of it that way. But to me, that type of a model fits best with what we see, knowing now in modern science, these things like amnesia, brain disorders, brain injuries, and these dissociative fugues. Also things like multiple personality disorder, things like that. So that is neurophysical reality. The brain's role in conscious reality. Now, paranormal reality, that's the second one. Paranormal reality, experiences such as out-of-body experiences, apparitions, EVPs, electronic voice phenomena. That's another way of studying ghosts, trying to get some sort of information about ghosts. Maybe they can speak to us from the afterlife. And similar reports don't necessarily tell us anything about God, if you think about it. But if they are genuine, what they do suggest is that consciousness may not be completely confined to the physical body. The third one is supernatural reality. So what's different about this one is that, this one doesn't really say that much, but it does say something pretty amazing. I shouldn't underrate it too much. It does say there is some sort of consciousness that goes outside of the body. There is some sort of life after death. Supernatural reality, though, says that there is a spiritual reality out there, and there are spiritual beings, in fact, that can affect or influence the physical reality. I guess the paranormal one also sort of says that in a small way with ghosts, that they can have some sort of impact with people, namely scaring them. In this case, you're talking about spiritual beings like angels, or saints who have died in the past or something like that, that can come back and appear and interact with physical reality. These also include things like demonic encounters or demonic possession. Also the remarkable mass Marian sightings at Zaytun. I was pronouncing that Zaytun or Zaytun. I don't know how I was pronouncing it last week, but the correct pronunciation is Zaytun. And since I recorded that episode last week, I did some more research into that. I was trying to find videos or any sort of films that were made of that Zaytun experience. And I found that there were two other experiences that were really similar, also in Egypt. One just a few minutes away from the St. Mary Church where Zaytun happened, and one that's about 200 miles away down south, down along the Nile. That place that's 200 miles away, that one is called Assuat. And then there's another one that's called Warwick. So the Assuat one, that's 200 miles south of Zaytun, and it occurred these were also multiple instance events where crowds were able to gather over multiple periods of time, and that photography, videoing, especially as you get later on, this one was in the year 2000 to 2001, and this was 2009 to 2010. I should add that the spiritual reality, the question that's you're trying to gain knowledge about is, can spiritual beings interact with humanity? And if these encounters, these phenomena are genuine, or if any of them are genuine, then the answer is yes, they can. Now, whatever one's interpretation of these three different events, we did talk about Fatima, which would be a fourth event, but I'm talking about these three that all happened. This was in Portugal. These are all in Egypt, and they're all more recent. Whatever one's interpretation of these events are, they show that reported mass spiritual phenomena have continued even into modern times. In the case of all three of these, that's what kind of links these three, is that there were three different phenomena that were witnessed. So all three of them, there was some sort of what was described as a female glowing or luminescent angelic figure that hovered around the dome of the church, or the high areas of these three churches. These are all three different Coptic churches, and people could see this person, and they were interpreted at the time as Mary, and maybe it was Mary. I don't know. But especially Zaytun, this was the Church of St. Mary. The other had names as well. Churches always have some, Catholic and Coptic churches have some sort of a name associated with them. But this one specifically, Zaytun, was the Church of St. Mary. So they all three had that. And they also had these dove-like or pigeon-like bright luminescent phenomenon that would fly around and move around rapidly, and that they would sometimes form formations. You can see in some of the pictures, there's like a diamond figure and one that's like chevron. Just really bizarre. And all three of these, they were reported. And then the other thing that they all had in common is they all had healings that were reported. And in some cases, they referred to them as verified healings, insofar as there was medical records that described that some of these people had some sort of terrible disease that was then now gone, and there was no explanation for how it happened. I know in the Zaytun case, there was someone who had cancer and was only supposed to live another week or two, brain cancer, and they were healed. Suddenly, images of their brain no longer showed cancer, and the person lived a normal life after that. So all three of these are linked together. I don't know why Mary or some female looking angel would appear over Coptic churches in Egypt. I'm sure God knows. But if these things are real, and where they were witnessed by, this was over 100,000 people over time, because remember, it was a 4-year period. These were also tens of thousands of people over the period that they occurred. So we're talking about many, many people of different backgrounds: Catholic, Coptic, Muslim, atheists, and journalists and government officials. I know, and one thing I learned about the Zaytun case is that they turned the electricity off to the town because they thought that if it was a hoax and it involved some sort of electricity, maybe a light being beamed from some nearby building, or maybe somebody that's just physically up on the roof, but they have some lights pointing at them. Whatever it is, if it involved electricity, they shut the power off. And the Marian figure and the fire doves, they kept on going just as they had before, so it didn't have any effect. So they did try to disprove these, especially the Zaytun one. Actually, in these other two as well, they did try to disprove them, try to come up with simple things as to how somebody could hoax these things. But in all three cases, they couldn't come up with them. I'm sure there are some ideas out there of how they could be hoaxed, but you can search for these on YouTube, and I would encourage you to do so, because since there were so many people that saw this, and that they were so similar in a similar vicinity to each other, they really are something that should be at least known. Let's talk about this last one, scriptural reality. So in scriptural reality, it's like supernatural reality, but these types of phenomenon are a divine or possibly divine revelation that expands our knowledge of the spiritual reality. So they're more focused than supernatural reality because they have the possibility of telling us in a more authoritative way about what the afterlife is, what the spiritual reality is. Now, the one I put in here, the only one that I can think of really from all of these different types of paranormal and supernatural phenomena that we discovered or we talked about, the only one that I could see that could fit into this category are near-death experiences. Now, I put in here the New Testament as well. So that's strange, I think, to see the New Testament as a phenomenon. It is a different type of phenomenon. It's not a fleeting phenomenon, and it's not a luminous figure or anything like that. But Christians do believe that, and we're talking billions of people, that God has supernaturally delivered these stories and narratives of not only the Old Testament, but also the New Testament. The New Testament is uniquely to Christians. It isn't a phenomenon in the sense of an observable thing, a fleeting observation like a near-death experience or the Zaytun event, but it is a divine revelation that records and interprets phenomenon. In the next slide, we'll talk about near-death experiences. And in the final slide, we'll talk about near-death experiences that are actually recorded in the Bible. So, near-death experiences, how do they inform us about spiritual reality? Why are they special of all the phenomenon? And I would say they're special because they suggest that consciousness may continue beyond clinical death and provide remarkable, albeit varied, first-hand reports, and they raise important questions about the afterlife. Now, of course, they require discernment, and they can't establish doctrine or anything like that, but we're talking about a sentient human being who came very close to death, and in a lot of these cases that were studied were brain dead. They're definitely dead from a cardiac standpoint, from their heart beating. The person was dead as far as any medical official could tell, modern medical official could tell, but they come back to life, and not only that, which would be, miraculous, for their loved ones, and everybody would be just overjoyed that their loved one that they thought was dead is now back, but they also now consciously can describe what they experienced. And that is pretty remarkable if they are genuine. If it's not, the materialist view would say that these are just the death throes of the brain. There's a lot of things that don't make sense from that. There's no reason why the brain would evolve. Again, this is a materialist view. Evolve to show somebody a pleasant, bright light that their loved ones are there, and they feel this overwhelming peace and acceptance. There's just nothing that the materialist view could point to that would say this is why people would commonly, or in a lot of cases, that they would have these common experiences, these common near-death experiences. Okay, so here's some interesting statistics. So there are thousands of reported experiences, and about 10% of the general population report an experience meeting the established research criteria for a near-death experience in one international study using what's called the Grayson NDE scale. We'll talk about some of these people that investigated. It's something that has been well documented and researched by professionals in the industry who would know something about someone who's died, the types of memories they could possibly have. And a lot of these people didn't actually even say, we know what this is. We know that this person went to heaven and came back. They didn't make any sort of interpretation like that. They were really just trying to figure out what were these experiences about. That's a pretty high number of the population that have some sort of near-death experience, and that 1 out of 10 say that during this time period they had some sort of experience, that they were out of their body. An even higher percentage, to 20% of people who came close to death or died and then came back, that they report an NDE across the prospective hospital studies. Of those people who had near-death experiences in a hospital setting, up to 20% of them report a near-death experience. And it's a similar high number for people who are cardiac arrest survivors. Of those people who survived a serious cardiac arrest where their heart stopped and they were clinically dead for a certain amount of time, that studies report that 15 to 20% of them have this near-death experience. Here are some of these major researches. It started in 1975 with Raymond Moody. He was a psychiatrist. He wrote this book called Life After Life. He tried to describe these near-death experiences that he was hearing about from a serious scientific standpoint. Altogether, with all these different people, we have 50 years of study on near-death experiences. Now, this other person, next person, Bruce Grayson, he's this one who created the Grayson NDE scale. He was also a psychiatrist, created this Grayson scale. Sam Parnia, he was a critical care physician. So this is somebody like in the ER who comes and people are close to death or they're in a very serious condition, and a lot of those people will die and a small number of them will undie. They will come back. Pim van Lommel, I don't know what that is. So he published perhaps the most influential perspective study in The Lancet, which is a very prestigious journal, medical journal, and that was in 2001. So that means it has to be peer-reviewed, and it has to be something that written in a way that the Lancet would decide to publish it in their journal. He showed about 18%. This is where this number here came from. But 18% of cardiac arrest survivors report NDEs. These last two people, they had their own near-death experience. So this guy, Eben Alexander, you can look him up on the internet. He was a Harvard-trained neurosurgeon. He had this very serious illness where he died. I'm not sure how long he was out of his body, but because he was a neuroscientist, he could tell afterwards from the types of EEGs that were recorded while he was dead that there was no way his brain could have formed these memories. At least that's what he said. And he wrote this book called Proof of Heaven. And then you have Mary Neal. She was an orthopedic surgeon. She had her own NDE. She was in a kayak and drowned. And it was cold water. So if you know anything about that, where the body can be in a survivable state. But she reports having this near-death experience. And she wrote a book called To Heaven and Back. These NDEs describe things like heaven and hell and Christ and relatives and peaceful feelings, and some of them have this judgment, and they're from these renowned neurologists, psychologists, cardiologists. There is no universally accepted explanation. So none of these people have come out, or science itself has not come out and said, this is exactly what's happening. It's just a really odd thing that the materialist view has a very hard time describing. The spiritual views, though, the three spiritual views all say that spirit left the body, and then for some reason, just either God or maybe they were given the choice to come back, but they came back to their body, and their spirit had this consciousness outside of their life that was able to take note of what their surroundings were, what they were seeing, and also what they were feeling. And they were able to describe that to other people after they enter their bodies. Now, up to 85% of these people that have these near-death experiences describe a pleasant setting. So that's this idea of the bright light, maybe angels or Jesus or other loved ones, but it's in peacefulness and joy and love. That's a pleasant experience. 10% say they had a distressing experience. And then 5% just have this emotionally neutral one. Maybe they don't remember much. I'm not sure. But if this is the case, that would say something scripturally important about the afterlife. Think about scriptures like narrow road and the narrow path that leads to heaven and the broad road that leads to destruction. There's a lot about Christian doctrine, even though Christianity is different between different churches, that would indicate that only a small number, certainly less than 50%, but maybe, even less than, nobody's going to give a percentage, of course, but even, fractions of a percent of people will actually be saved according to various Christian doctrines. So if that's the case, why are such a high percentage of these NDEs having pleasant experiences? Well, something we talked about at the end of the prior series about the flood, I described something called dual moralism. And that's this idea that only some people are morally aware and most people are morally neutral. And that it's only the morally aware people that have to fight in this life to find salvation. Again, it's just an idea. Don't write any books about it or establish any doctrine on it. But what it's trying to do is describe something just like this. Why are so many people reporting these pleasant experiences? Well, maybe a lot of them are morally neutral. Maybe a lot of these other ones, these distressing ones, come from morally aware people who are now being warned that they need to change things around so that they can go to heaven. That would be a prediction of dual moralism, is that if NDEs reflect genuine glimpses of the afterlife, pleasant experiences would greatly outnumber distressing ones. If anything, from these different descriptions of near-death experiences, they should at least show that they deserve our serious consideration, but as Christians, our ultimate question isn't merely what people report, it's what God has chosen to reveal to us. How does the New Testament reveal spiritual reality? Well, the answer is that it only describes it to us in a small number of verses throughout the Bible, but mainly in the New Testament. There are this group of people who had near-death experiences in the New Testament. So you had Jairus' daughter, that's in Mark 5, the widow's son, that's in Luke 7, and then of course you probably know of Lazarus in John 11. These people were dead for a different amount of time. Jairus' daughter was dead for about an hour, and that's because she was initially alive when he left, and however long it took for him, at some point, word came to him that she had died. Now, in that case, Jesus, even though the report was that she had died, I think even Jairus was like, you know what, sorry to have bothered you. Jesus is like, nope, she's only asleep. And he goes, and people are laughing at him, actually, because he says she's just asleep. He goes in there and resurrects her. He actually tells her, and I'm sure her parents, Jairus and her mom, were there, do not say anything about this. Could very well just be the fact that I resurrected you, but also I think it would include any sort of experiences that she had while she was dead. So it doesn't mean that she had a near-death experience. Of course, the Bible doesn't say that. But if she did have one, she was told not to say anything about it. Now, the widow's son, I thought maybe was dead for a couple of days, but really it was probably more like a couple of hours. And that's because in that culture, you were supposed to bury somebody within the day. That's still true in a lot of cultures. Luke says that Jesus encountered the funeral procession as the body was being carried out of Nain, that was the town, for burial. The man was already placed on a bier and accompanied by a large crowd, so enough time had passed for them to have ceremonially washed the body and prepare the body for being entombed, and to assemble some mourners and begin this procession out of the town to wherever the tombs were. It does say in this case that he sat up and started to talk. Whatever he said, the Bible doesn't tell us if he had some sort of near-death experience or something like that. So then John 11, this was Lazarus. He, of course, also doesn't say anything. There's nothing recorded about what he saw while he was dead for 4 days. But the 4 days is known, and it's noted in the text because it's very important that he was dead for 4 days. And that's because the early Jewish tradition held that the soul lingered near the body for about 3 days before departing completely. And that's not established in the Bible or anything, but that belief came from the fact that really up until recently in history are people able to have things like ECGs or EEGs or pulse oxes or modern neurological testing. In the absence of that type of medical information that can indicate that someone is really dead and not just almost dead, then up until recently in history, it was more often than today, it turned out that they were mistakenly thought to be dead. They weren't dead. And so that is probably where this Jewish teaching or this Jewish tradition came from, that the soul lingered around the body. But in no cases were there anything like that where somebody came to life after 3 days. And so that is why the scripture is really clear in the case of Lazarus that he was dead, that there was an odor in the tomb, and that he came out and he was wrapped in his burial, the shroud. And it makes the miracle unmistakably one of resurrection, not resuscitation or a hoax or anything like that. So could Lazarus or Jairus' daughter or the widow's son, could they have privately shared something with their family and friends about their experience while they were dead? They could have, but the New Testament doesn't tell us. So if they did, the Holy Spirit chose not to preserve those accounts for us to be able to read in modern times through the Bible. The other thing to note is that all of these resurrections occurred before Jesus' own resurrection. So when I talk about the New Testament, I'm really talking about the New Covenant, which started at Jesus' resurrection. In John 14, 1 through 3, do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. That were not so. Would I have not told you that I am going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, so that you may also be where I am. Jesus says that when he dies, after his resurrection, he's going to go up and prepare all these rooms for us. And so there is something that changes in the spiritual reality at Jesus' resurrection. And that's really what we're going to be focusing on. And that would be the present spiritual reality. So it's difficult to know what the spiritual reality was before Jesus' death and resurrection. There's not a lot in the Old Testament. We talked about that in some of the earlier episodes. But there's also not a lot in the New Testament. But whatever it is in the New Covenant, so from Jesus' resurrection and on, we can know that that has something to do with the current spiritual reality that we need to deal with through Scripture. Hope you enjoyed this episode and are enjoying this series on spiritual realities. In the remaining 2 episodes, we're going to be talking about what the New Covenant says about the spiritual reality and about the afterlife. It's also a small number of verses. So just like in the cases of the spiritual phenomenon, we'll also have to look at these scriptures and glean as much as we can from them. So hopefully you can look forward to that. Remember to like and subscribe. Liking and commenting on the video really does help YouTube's algorithm to recommend these to other people. But have a great evening.